It's absolutely incredibly important to recognize what comes easily to you and to be leveraging that, really leaning in on the things that you're uniquely good at, because that's what's going to differentiate you in any market within any profession.
Jared, I'm so glad to have you on Titans of Transition. I saw your TED Talk and really resonated with the points you made. I really am interested in the whole process of people becoming fulfilled in their choice of their career direction and that whole journey people get on. In your TED Talk, you talked about how messy that process can be. And you also brought in the whole idea of identity and how we form those identities and how they're not static. I just thought, wow, this is a great talk, really added a lot to my understanding. So I wanted to have you on so we could unpack that. So again, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been really gratifying to see over the years how the talk has resonated with so many people around the world.
It's awesome. What I usually do is ask my guests to unpack their main transition stories, one or two during these interviews. You have several that are quite interesting, and I also resonated with that. I've had like three careers, um, and I see that you made some kind of major shifts as well. And we'll definitely want to touch on those. I thought maybe another twist we might want to take at this, or another approach, is that we would bring in some of those key lessons earlier in our discussion. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and how you landed on that.
Well, so what I do now is I'm the executive director of the Career Center at Wesleyan University, which is a highly selective small liberal arts college in Connecticut. And I attended a small liberal arts college as well. So in some ways it was coming full circle. And even though I had spent most of my development career working with folks who were older, so graduate students, JDs, MBAs, people who were often a lot in their 20s, but I also worked with plenty of people who were in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, getting close to retirement. And I had an interest in going back to working with undergraduates, in part because I remembered keenly what my own experience was like transitioning from a liberal arts college into the work world. And at the time, I graduated during a terrible economy when everybody was struggling. My dad was a banker, and that was something that appealed to me. So I thought, what are the options for someone coming out of this type of institution? And I knew I didn't want to be in New York. So that cut off a huge part of the sector, right? So you're not going to do the kind of big Wall Street finance if you don't want to be in New York. I was looking at Boston, and just the job market was terrible. And I ended up landing in an advertising agency, in part because I had kind of creative bent and I thought that might be an interesting thing to do. I was interested in copywriting. There was another Smith grad, someone who graduated a year ahead of me, who was already at the agency, who spoke highly of it. And, long story short, it was a complete disaster. I mean, I lasted 8 months in the position, but there was a lot of lessons learned from that. And, one of them was sort of thinking about how much experimentation do you sometimes need to do after you graduate from college? So to answer your question, how did I get involved in this kind of work? It was because by the time I was in my late 20s, I had already had several careers and got interested in working with people on those career transitions.
Mhm.
And that eventually ended up coming full circle to what I'm doing now.
So it's kind of like a matter of or a process of trying things on. I mean, you do the best you can to sort of discern the path that's best for you, that either the role or the nature of what you will be doing. But until you really try it on, you don't really know. And I think there's a process or something people go through where they try to hang on to things that aren't particularly a good fit for
Mhm.
quite a while. And then there's this sort of friction, or I call it this dissonance that goes on. And,
Right.
they feel almost like they should be, there's something wrong with them or something wrong with you if you're in the middle of this because you think, well, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Why am I not enjoying it? Why do I feel exhausted? Why am I unfulfilled?
Right.
Kind of what I got from your talk, and this is kind of a natural process.
Right, and you have to keep in mind that, like, how society is set up, and I don't even just mean American society, how we as humans, have set up our society in terms of training young people to enter the work world is often at odds
Mhm.
with how we're actually experiencing that process and healthy for us to do in terms of figuring out what is a good fit. For most of human history, people did what their parents
Yeah.
did. If your father was a farmer and you were male, you went into farming and women kept up whatever that home looked like,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
That kind of thing is still true in many parts of the world. And when you start looking at, okay, now we're moving to an industrial society, people might not be doing exactly what their parents did, you were still going to be highly influenced by what they were doing, if not literally by their profession and following in someone's footsteps, but by all of the societal roles that you've now been plugged into by virtue of your social class, your gender, where you live. There's all of these factors, right, that play into that. And the way even now, like, fast forward to now, when people talk about, how do we get young people prepared for the work world? It's getting them to, okay, well, they need to set goals. They need to set goals early so that they're on the right educational path, so they're taking the right classes, they're getting the right training, so that they can enter something that is going to be fulfilling for them and what society actually needs. And there's 2 big problems with it that are often not quite captured, right? One is that what society needs is a constantly moving target.
Mhm.
I often tell, like, incoming first-year students, like, I don't know what the jobs are going to be when you graduate. Nobody does. I've been doing this for decades, right? So that constantly needing to adapt and be prepared to be constantly changing whatever it is you're doing. So that's a huge piece of it that is constantly a problem. The other problem that is, in a certain way, if we do it right, fixed by the first one, is that people don't know what they want to do until they start doing it. So, if you're
Mhm.
asking people to think about when they're in middle school, my daughter just finished middle school. People are already asking her, what are you going to do? What are you going to focus on in high school? Because you got to get ready for college.
Uh,
She's like, how should I know? I'm 13 years old. And there are some countries, and I think this is why my talk has resonated around the world. I hear frequently from people in countries where they're being forced by their educational systems to be making decisions fairly early on what educational tracks they're going to take
mm.
in ways that may feel like they make sense for that local society, that local culture, the local government, in terms of making sure that positions are filled. But if you're asking someone at an early age to make decisions that are effectively going to dictate what they're doing 10, 20 years later, that can cause a lot of dissatisfaction once somebody's in their 20s and is actually starting to work in these positions, especially if they're feeling trapped. Like, I've been educated in this one thing and I don't have an easy way of re educating myself in something else. So I think that if you have the privilege of a free society,
Mhm.
right? And specifically, am I getting what I need to be getting out of what I'm doing now? And if I'm not, what do I need to be learning to shift to something else?
I
And
think
how should
we
I be constantly thinking about that?
I think, as well-intentioned parents want to try to identify the path or help your child identify their path because it's so highly competitive. That decision point seems to be moved further and further in. So now there's a whole phase of optimizing the preparation process before you even get out of high school to make sure that you've had obviously all the right coursework, but also all the other factors there that would be considered if you want to get into a specific college to keep you on track for a specific
Yeah.
career, that sort of thing. So not enough time for experimentation. The experimentation process tends to happen after the commit process quite a bit.
It's true in some respects. I think that one thing that's important to keep in mind is there's only a relatively small slice of American universities that are really so selective that you need to be really, at the top of everything you're trying to do when you're in high school to get in. And Wesleyan, the school I work for, is one of those institutions, right? It is, we
Mhm.
admit fewer than 20% of students in a typical year. And the students who we do admit are very, very high achieving, right? But it's not that we're expecting them to sign on the dotted line that they're all gonna go into this profession or that profession.
Yeah.
Highly selective in particular institutions, that is frequently the case. We wanna know that students have very strong academic interests, but unless they're really specific on something like a specific type of engineering, I mean, there's some outlier examples where that
Mhm.
would be more true, but in general, what we're really looking for is an academic prowess and interest rather than a narrow
Mhm.
career
Okay.
interest.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm not saying there aren't, but I think that, like, if I were talking to my daughter who, like, is just starting high school, unless you are really specifically, I've always been fascinated by airplanes. I want to
Mhm.
major in aerospace engineering. I have never questioned that path. I absolutely know that's what I want. Well, then, yeah, guiding yourself through a high school path that's going to get you to that college path, get you to that career path, that makes sense. I find that that kind of certainty, even in one's 20s,
Mhm.
is very rare.
It is.
I mean, the talk is not rare. You talk to a lot of high school students, a lot of college students who are able to say all the right things
Mhm.
because they've been kind of trained and taught and acculturated that that's what they're
Mhm.
supposed to do. Someone asks you, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" You give a really fancy answer. "I
Yeah.
want to be a surgeon." And then you get really positive feedback from adults that you wanna be a surgeon. So you continue to say you wanna be a surgeon, and then suddenly you're a junior in college, and you're going through the motions. You have no idea if you wanna be a surgeon, right?
Yeah.
So, when we're working with students, our health professions advisor, if there's a student who wants to be a surgeon, okay, well, have you gotten EMT training? Go be an EMT for a while. Do you really like blood and guts? Like,
Yeah,
you don't
exactly.
know until you know, right?
Right, right. And you don't have a sort of full knowledge set of what
Right.
that really is. The idea of it's a little separated from the reality of it. So we've been talking quite a bit right now about sort of the external factors, if you will, or influences maybe might be a better
Mhm.
word. And you talked about historically going way back, you did what your father did or your family did, you know,
Right.
even names like my name is Miller,
Yeah.
although it actually was Mueller and changed, it was German. But, you know, there are people who expect you to be involved with milling grain or something,
Right.
which are it's
Right.
interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, why Smith is the most popular last name.
yeah,
Blacksmith, like a
yeah,
smith, you were doing something, right?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. But there's also, I think, other things that come into play. You mentioned lawyer or surgeon or
Sure.
doctor, uh, picking things that have that moniker of success,
Right.
financial independence that everyone would want to have. So it's almost like you have all these different things you're trying to optimize for. And sometimes those things get weighted differently depending upon, your upbringing or your influences.
Well, there's upbringing and influences, and there's also visibility.
Oh, tell me
One
more
of
about that. Yeah.
one of the reasons why, medicine and law are perennially popular are because people know or they think they know what a lawyer does because 'cause they've
Mhm.
watched lawyers on TV, even if they don't have one in the family or something, right?
Mhm.
They feel like they know what a lawyer does. And typically, they've been to the doctor at some point, so they understand what a doctor does, or they think they understand, right? At least what a pediatrician or a primary care physician, they have a sense of what that day-to-day is, and it's why teaching is also often popular, right? Because 'Cause you've had teachers, and you have a sense of what a teacher does. So
Mhm.
things that are visible
Familiar and
are
visible.
always popular because people feel like, "Well, I know what that is, and that's something I can see myself doing." Which is great up to a point. The problem is that you don't really know what all types of doctors do, what all types of lawyers do. You don't know what everybody else does. So, what most people, you're not going to see what all of these other things are. So, like somebody who works in cybersecurity, right?
Right.
What exactly does that involve? So, like, I can see a doctor, I can see a teacher. I can't see a cybersecurity specialist, let's say, but I'm reading in the media that I'll always have a job if I go into that. So then you do get actually things that become popular because it seems safe and secure.
Mhm.
And I think that's an important other layer here because law and medicine remain popular because they feel safe and stable and prestigious, and
Mhm.
those things all kinda go together.
So
The problem being that that's all kind of fallen apart, that now there is no such thing as safe and stable.
yeah,
So
so that's a
people are
that's a
trying to chase that.
yeah, that's a good one. So I mean, you kind of touched on we touched on the significance kind of view of things where certain things that you see that are visible have that maybe we didn't unpack that too much, but societal sort of affirmation of those
Right.
careers. So there's the significance factor. This is really getting pop psychology here. And then there's the security. And those two things kind of bouncing back and forth and trying to get both at the same time, might be one way of looking at this. But the other thing I wanted to talk about is the overall journey of this. And
Mhm.
as you said, you engage a lot with people who are starting out, but quite a bit of people who are well into their careers, that are well into their journey, that need clarity. And it's interesting. I'd like to unpack that a little bit, and maybe there's examples from the transitions you've gone through too. Let's say someone had done the best they can to pick a career path. They've gone through
Mhm.
an educational track, and maybe they've gotten a degree, they've gotten out and gotten their first job or so. But now they're kind of questioning or they're thinking about a change.
Yeah.
So, talk a little bit about that and your experience with that and how you've helped others through that process.
Yeah, and I mean, if I'm sitting down with somebody who is starting on that process of thinking about a change, a lot of what I'm doing in that conversation, it's almost like a physician doing a diagnostic, getting a sense of what their whole history has been with decision making. How did they go about making that choice of, say, where to go to school, how they got into the first job, the second job, the third job, and the extent to which that they were following a path of least resistance
Hmm.
versus making really conscious choices, and to what extent I see a pattern in their ability to really reflect on, during the course of their career, how they were making those transitions they've already made.
Hmm.
And this was something I saw a lot when I was actually doing my dissertation research, that I went out and interviewed a bunch of people who were all they were successful on paper. They
Hmm.
went to good schools, they had good jobs, they looked successful, but when you actually started talking to them, there was a subset who really had never gotten off the path of least resistance. They had maybe taken the first job because mom knew somebody at the company, and
Mhm.
then they were good at it, and even though they didn't particularly like it, they kept getting raises and promotions, and then suddenly they had a mortgage and 2 kids, right? And there was never a point where things got so bad that they felt like they had to leave, but they've never been particularly satisfied either.
Mhm.
And
So things were sort of comfortable, but they hadn't had a major challenge to get them
right.
into that sort of mindset of,
Right, of really having, and I find that the people who really were satisfied with their careers are the ones who really never let themselves fall into that path of least resistance. They may have taken jobs here and there
mm,
because they needed to pay off the loans or, for whatever reason, but even if they were in a position that was not a good fit, they were actively trying to work their way out of it. So, for instance, it was common back at the time that these folks graduated from college to temp for a while where they were trying to find a full-time position, particularly if they just moved to a new city. But were they using that time as a temp, trying to meet people around the organization and get a sense of what those other roles were and how they might fit into them and trying to build those professional connections? Because that ability to understand that you need to constantly be building that professional network and constantly be getting input from
mm,
others and unpacking yourself. If I'm hearing what this person does all day, is that something I would want to do as well? Could I see myself doing what this person is
mm,
doing and why? And if not, why not? can I keep going deep into my own reactions about what I'm doing, how I'm feeling about it? I mean, I'll go back to a specific example of an early job that I had where was I overall happy? No, I was not. And I had to sit down and figure out, well, how much of this is the job itself, the day to day? Am I in the right career path? And I figured out, okay, I'm really happy with that. What I'm doing day to day is something that's really fulfilling to me. So then I had to go another layer and say, okay, well, does it have something to do with my boss? There's this common thing, right?
Sure.
People don't believe bosses. And I realized sort of, but what was really happening was that my boss was under a lot of pressure from higher up to do things
Mhm.
that didn't make sense. And that was pushing downward pressure on the rest of us to be doing things that didn't make sense. And I ended up writing a whole paper about this in graduate school, about this whole dynamic and how it was playing out and everything else for an organizational behavior class. But I think, one of the things I'm doing when I'm meeting with someone who feels stuck is trying to parse, are you in the wrong career or are you in the wrong organization? Are you in the wrong functional area? Are you simply working for the wrong person?
Mhm.
Are you getting bad direction? So there's a lot of different ways that people can be unhappy.
Sure.
And what can happen is if you get really unhappy, you kind of go on a downward spiral where it becomes really hard to parse all of these things. And what I've seen often in advising is that people will look to something that is the polar opposite of what they're doing in the moment. So I'll go back to a personal example. I mentioned that I worked for an ad agency right after college and it was a disaster, right?
Mhm.
So I was so unhappy and so inexperienced. I was 21. So I started looking at things, okay, if I hate every single thing about my life, what is the opposite of this? So I started interviewing for a campsite in Maine where I was going to be living alone in a trailer for most of the year and then running a family camp in the summer.
You like to test the boundary
Oh,
conditions,
it was
right?
like, yeah. And I mean, I had been a camp counselor in college. So I thought, I'm going to double down on the exact opposite of what I'm doing. And I
Wow.
remember my father sitting me down, like, we need to talk about this. Like, really?
What are
You're
you
going to live in a
thinking?
trailer 20 minutes from the nearest post office by yourself in the middle of winter? Like, it sounds like a Stephen King novel. I did not end up doing that. I just switched jobs in Boston. But I'm glad I had that experience only because I've identified it so many times over the years working with, in particular, like early to mid career
Mhm.
clients who come to me and say, I'm doing this thing now and this is what I want to be doing. And
Mhm.
if I see that what I want to be doing is in every way the opposite of what they're doing now, like we're going to really unpack what's going on.
Well, it reminds me of a coaching framework question
Mm,
that I ask often, and that is, do you feel like you're moving away from something in this
mm,
change you're thinking about,
yeah.
or do you feel like you're moving towards something? It's a way of, it doesn't get to all the specificity you're referring to, but it does get to sort of the motivational aspect.
Well, and not only that, but it's not uncommon in job interviews for interviewers to get really at that exact question. When I'm coaching
Mhm.
people sometimes if they're really desperate to get out of what they're doing, they'll start pushing back on some of the more counseling aspects of these conversations or just tell me how to apply, just tell me how to get through the interview. One of the things I always have to point out is if you don't have all this stuff sorted out in advance, you're
Yeah.
never going to make it through a high level behavioral interview with employers because what they really started looking at is not only are you a good fit for us, but are we a good fit for you? Because retention is an issue for everybody.
Mhm.
There's a war for talent. We want to be able to get the best workers, retain the best workers. And part of that is knowing that this is a well thought out decision on your part.
Yeah.
And if you're applying to us because you're reacting against something that's happening in your current job, that's going to be a problem. So being able to really articulate, not just to me, the career advisor, but to an interviewer, this isn't about why I want to leave my current employer. It's about why I want to be with you.
Yes.
This is a really well thought out decision on my part to move into this new area. That's what's going to land the job.
Sometimes people just go with the flow in picking their direction.
Yeah.
So there's kind of tying into that is agency
Mhm.
and intention. intentionality, and awareness.
Yeah.
And they kind of go together. And I was reminded of those words as you were going through that thinking process, because it's very common for people to go with the flow. It's very
Right.
difficult in coaching situations, which I do a fair amount of. When you ask a person what they want, they have never even thought about it,
Right.
you know? And it seems, and at first blush, you think, well, they just need help going through a process. Well, that may help, but there's layers and layers below
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
about a lot of different things.
Yeah, but we've built a society around that. I mean, to be
Yeah,
what are you gonna major in? What are you gonna do after graduation? What do you do for a living? These are things that are kind of baked into the ether, and I think, we need to own that too and recognize that it actually takes some work to push past that and to really be thinking about, well, my college major does not really need to dictate what I'm doing at 40.
right.
That most people are gonna be switching careers, they're gonna be switching jobs, and the constant it's really more of a set of habits of mind, so that regardless of what is happening in the moment, you're constantly able to reflect back on, "Is what I'm doing now working for me?
Mhm.
And if not, why not?" And that doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna cut the cord immediately and move on to something else, but you're gonna have really strategic reasons for staying where you are. So I'm not really happy in my job,
Mhm.
but I understand that the money I'm making now, I need to be here for at least another year before I pay off this student loan.
Right,
But I know that that's the case, and I have a timeline for it, and I have an exit strategy, right?
right, right.
And if I'm not clear on what the next step is, I'm going to take some time to figure out, okay, what's not working for me and how can I course correct? So maybe I love my organization, but this particular role isn't working for me. So I'm going to take the time to go out and understand and learn, meet other people around my organization, understand what they do, understand what the career paths might be. And if I don't see a way forward, I'm going to figure out, where can I get what I like about this someplace else.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna keep following the path of least resistance. But it does take a certain amount of mental energy to go through that.
it
It does need to
it
take a
absolutely
willingness
does.
for
Yeah.
self-reflection, and that can be hard.
It can be especially hard when someone is in the middle of a deficit of that
Sure.
mental energy because of the situation.
Absolutely.
Thing I wanted to chat with you about was I believe that we focus so much on jobs types or career
Mhm.
paths by name, lawyer, doctor, whatever.
Right.
And then once we get out into the workforce, we focus so much on job titles
Mhm.
that it seems like we don't talk a lot about attributes that are part of those paths or those titles. And
Mhm.
I have a belief that there's certain innate, well, strengths that an individual has been given, gifts, strengths, whatever you want to call it, and fulfillment. Part of the being fulfilled in your career and your life is really identifying that, or that constellation of things,
Yeah.
and trying to spend most of your energy and time in alignment with that. And
Absolutely.
and those constellation of gifts, if you will, could be valuable to a whole list of different careers or jobs.
Absolutely.
Sometimes the other thing that happens, you talked about kind of what we have done to ourselves a little bit from a society standpoint, making this difficult for people. But the other thing happens is there's certain expectations when you're in a job that certain things have to be done in a certain way. I
Mhm.
used to trick myself. A little story. I hated budgeting. I was a CIO, Chief Information Officer, and budgeting was a big part of that job,
Sure.
but I hated it. I'm more of an improviser, quick start. I'm terrible at doing prolonged detail work.
Okay.
And that's kind of the budgeting
It is.
and
I
it
do it
took
too.
me well into my career, a third through, maybe halfway, till I realized that actually I could look around on my team and identify someone who got off on doing that, just got energized by doing that kind of work and said, "Here, I will give it to you, and I will lump all kinds of praise on you. I will
Right,
overall, I'll become more successful because I'm going to lean into the things that I'm really good at and avoid
right,
that. But I can still do the job. And I think that can be a factor because you can be in the middle of a job where it's not a fit. If you understand those gifts, you can see where they might be,
right, right.
born different. What's your reaction to that idea?
I think it's absolutely incredibly important to recognize what comes easily to you and to be leveraging that, really leaning in on the things that you're uniquely good at, because that's what's going to differentiate you in any market within any profession. I think what sometimes gets overlooked is you also need to identify the things that not only do not come naturally to you, but that
Mhm.
are a real struggle and things that are gonna be really hard to overcome,
Yeah.
because everybody has those too, and I'll tell a personal story as well. For me, that's memorization, and
Yeah.
this was something I didn't realize how hard that was for me until relatively late in the game, and, I actually went to college with the intention of studying art history, and unbeknownst to me, one of the first things you have to do when you decide on that major is, or at least that I had to do, is memorize just massive amounts of the famous works of art. We had something called the art study room, and it was this massive hallway.
Mm.
And they basically had put up like, this is pre-internet, right? They had
Sure.
postcards basically of different like famous works of art. So,
D
statues,
for
paintings,
different
buildings, right?
periods,
Different
who are
periods,
the
right?
people in this
With this
impressionistic period?
massive
Yeah.
survey
Yeah.
course. And, before exams, you were expected to go in and just memorize them. I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I simply couldn't do it. And one of my takeaways from that, though, was not only maybe this isn't the best major for me, and I did, in fact, not major in art history, but I also realized by extension that going to medical school or law school, neither of those things really interested in me when I was an undergraduate, but they also would have been logical given the type of
Mhm.
institution I was at and where a lot of what my friends were headed and everything. But I was like, well, if I can't do this, I'm never going to pass the bar.
Mm.
If I'm never going to be able to memorize everything you need to
Case
memorize to
law.
take
Yeah.
organic chemistry or something. Like this
I
is
was
just not
gonna use that example.
right. I mean, there's just no way.
Yeah.
So, the earlier you figure out the things that are never gonna work
Yes.
for you, and then look at the things that do work for you. So, I figured out, okay, where are my skills? Writing, presenting, being able to take a lot of disparate ideas from different fields and bring them together, which is a lot what I did in like an interdisciplinary doctoral program. Like it's not that I was useless, right? I had other strengths I could be
Mhm.
playing upon, but knowing kind of what these core weaknesses were as well as core strengths. I think the core strengths are easier to identify. It really did take me a long time to figure out exactly how bad I was at memorization.
I just have to go back to that one because and you said organic chemistry. My first career was analytic chemist
My
for
husband's a computational chemist by training.
oh, okay. I know what that is. I spent 10 years as an analytical chemist. Organic chemistry is all memorizing those key 25, I think it is,
I know it's
equations, uh,
clear.
reactions. Yeah, yeah, so but that's good. I mean, that's, I think, a good tool to help someone who to get clarity around what's a good fit is to identify those things that are just inordinately hard to do as an individual. You can develop skills and do things that are difficult. We don't want to take away that people shouldn't be willing to put out effort and work to become more skilled. But what we're talking
Absolutely.
about doesn't fall into that category.
Yeah, no, and
Yeah.
that's exactly right. Because I think the other thing and this is why it's hard, right? These are I'm not saying that these are easy things you're just gonna be able to sit down and do a quick list and be done. Like, it really takes some paying attention to how you have experienced different classes, different job experiences to be able to unpack this. So, another personal example, I didn't have great experiences with math and science when I was in high school. I chose a college in part because it wasn't gonna make me take those classes.
Mhm.
And when I realized that I was gonna need to kinda circle back on some quantitative stuff in order to take the graduate exams I knew I'd need to take down the road, I went ahead and I took calculus my senior year in college, but it was, we covered everything I covered in high school within the first few weeks of the college class. One of the reasons I'd put off taking it was it was known as being a really, really difficult course. They had gotten a big grant to work with another university to teach it in a very specific way that involved computer programming. People who took it were exhausted and crying and said it was horrible. Well, I was like, all right, I'm going to suck it up and take it. And it was one of the easiest classes that I took. It's math for me
Huh.
because it happened to come easily for me.
Mm-hmm.
And because I always had it in my head that I didn't have great experiences in high school and it was something I didn't like, I didn't choose
Mm-hmm.
to engage with it until it was too late to do anything with it but take that take the one
Mm-hmm.
course.
Mm-hmm.
It was a real learning experience. That's something I clearly should have taken freshman year because I could have avoided taking some classes that involved a lot of memorization that I didn't do as well in.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just want me to sit down and calculate stuff or type up some code to help calculate some stuff, I can do that. So,
Yeah.
but it kind of goes to you don't know really what come naturally to you until you really delve into some of these subjects. And this is why I get frustrated when people talk about, okay, well, when you start college, the stakes are really high, tuition is really high, you need to set clear goals and stick with them. I understand why that messaging is there, given how we fund higher education
Mm-hmm.
in this country and how deeply problematic it can be. The flip side is until you really get your hands dirty with different types of classes that really push you in new ways and get you really thinking about, well, how do you know what your interests are and how do you know what you're good at
Mm-hmm.
until you do start doing things at a higher level and get exposed to things at a higher level?
Right.
And the
Right.
same is then true for when you start in the work world, how you think about making these transitions down the road. It's not about making a dramatic shift from art history to banking, right? It's about what are some of those subtler changes, those transition changes that you can kind of kick the tires on. Well, what is it about this that isn't working for me? And what about that new thing that could be?
There's a lot there. And you reminded me of this kind of the journey aspect of this whole topic and how it isn't like one linear path from start to finish. And well, let me just say that I think there's at least three phases in my experience people go through, and they go through it multiple different times and many times. And rather than a line, maybe it's a circle. And you start out with some kind of a clarification phase or a discovery phase of this is what I think I want to do, whether it's at the very beginning, you're in high school or whatever.
Yeah.
You take your best shot at it from all different sources, and then you go into an execution process where you've launched out. You're
Right.
investing time, energy, dollars, and you're going down that path. And you go through this execution phase for a good while. Then you're starting to look and say, okay, I'm getting sort of into an intermediate skill level of what I'm doing. And then you start moving into what I call the mastery phase, where you're
Mhm.
starting to really get advanced.
Right.
And at sort of somewhere in that advanced period, you're starting to say to yourself, what's next? And so you go around the loop back into, I want to clarify what I want to do next, or this was all great, but I want more. I often talk to people who are kind of in the middle part.
Yeah.
They've reached some challenges in the execution, moving into mastery phase. They're not seeing rewards either intrinsically or from the outside
Mhm.
validation of what they've done or their contribution, not feeling like they're really flourishing. Now they're
Right.
starting to just go into sort of a discovery phase again. And people
Mhm.
can go around that period and
Right.
but you're not a failure. And we laugh, but sometimes people feel like even having a thought of changing a direction is like the worst possible thing. Then
Oh,
I
abs
must have made a mistake, right?
yeah. I'm actually teaching a course next year called Success and Failure, and one of the
To teach a
takeaways
course, that's great.
one of the takeaways that I hope students take is that, you know, something that is a small scale failure. You don't do well in a course, or you realize that you've always said you were going to be a doctor and now you're realizing that's not a path you want to take or should take or can't take because you failed organic chem or whatever. This doesn't mean you personally are a failure. that life is just these ebb and flows of things that are going to go your way and things that are not. And it's your ability to be resilient, and it's your ability to unpack, okay, what happened here and
Mhm.
what is under my control. It was that agency piece, and what is not. And how can I navigate my way through it? These are life skills, right, that
Mhm.
everybody has to learn. And I think that if you've been sort of successfully on a path of least resistance, and what I mean by that is there's been no kind of external force that's pushed you off of that, then it may be, you might be doing this at 45 instead of 25.
Mhm.
And, I like to say you're going to have to do the work sometime. And, big part of the reason I went back to working with undergraduates is to try to let's nip it in the bud now. If you can force students to do it before 22, they're less likely to wake up when they have a mortgage and 2 kids in college with a realization that they're feeling stuck and unhappy. But that also it goes to the habits of mind, because what you're identifying as well is people can be happy and fulfilled for a certain period of time and then realize that they're not, right? Because they're bored. They've been
Mhm.
doing the same thing for a while and needing to kind of hit the restart button in new ways. But I think if you've early on or at some point along the line have developed those habits of mind to be constantly taking your own temperature, when you get to that point where you're starting to get bored and you're starting to think this isn't really working for me anymore, you have those tools at your disposal to be really thinking through, okay, well, if I want to think about other options, what might those be? Who do I need to talk to get more information? What is realistic given my current family situation, financial situation, particularly if you're looking at doing this at midlife? And you're able to kind of weather that storm
Mhm.
more easily. You've poured a stronger foundation, so when the hurricane hits, the
Yeah,
whole house isn't going away.
built on the rock.
I grew up on an island, so I use the hurricane analogy. For those who have gone along with that path of least resistance, well, both my parents were doctors, so I became a doctor and it was fine. I didn't have problems with organic chemistry and I got through medical school and I was fine seeing my patients. But now I'm incredibly bored. I'm going through the motions. I think my patients are starting to see that, but
Mhm.
now I have a successful practice and I hate getting up in the morning, but I don't know what to do.
Mhm.
That's hard.
And as we talked about early on, things change
Mhm.
in the external world, and what used to be like to be a doctor and what the healthcare the way it is
Yeah.
these days. I probably have 5 or 6 doctors that I know who have left conventional
Oh,
medicine
yeah,
because it is a rat race.
absolutely.
And you have to shrink the amount of time you spend with your patients, all those things we all know about,
Well, and the debt that, if
and
we're
the
working
debt.
with students now that are looking at medical school, the level of debt that you're coming out
Crazy.
with medical school is really extreme. And I think, this is where I talk to students a lot about when they're focusing on these kind of historically prestigious careers and unpacking where that interest is coming from. And to be clear, with some students, it is actually very well thought out and they know exactly why they want to do it. And they've shadowed people in the specialties that they're interested in both law and medicine or engineering or what have you.
Mhm.
And it is a well thought out decision. I'm not saying this is universal. I'm not trying to badmouth the profession.
Sure.
But what I do find interesting is sometimes it's the student whose parents are like, well, both my parents are doctors, so they're telling me not to be a doctor, or
There you
both my
go.
parents are lawyers, so they're telling me not to be a lawyer because they've seen what these
Yeah,
changes are,
yeah.
right? Influence that's coming into that decision, it's based on outdated information. I was actually having this conversation relatively recently with a student who was interested, coming in saying, I want to go to law school. So we started talking about that. And what came out was that a parent had felt really strongly that this was a good, solid, stable profession where she could make money and support herself without having to rely on a spouse down the road. And that was a core
Mm.
value for that parent. And I said, "I understand that. I'm a parent. I completely appreciate that. Let me explain why law is probably not the best way to accomplish it." The average law school debt is 6 figures. The
Mhm.
average salary for a lawyer is not. If you really start unpacking all of the data, I said, no, if you decide that, you do all of the work in terms of figuring out exactly what this is, what's the path forward, the courses that you're going to want to take to get some exposure, you're going to talk to some attorneys, you're going to work as a paralegal or in some other role right after graduation, and you decide this is what you want to do. Yes, our institution has a really strong history of getting students into top law schools who then make really good salaries. But let's make sure that's really what you want first, because this is a very unstable profession in a way that it was not
Mm,
when maybe your
yeah.
parents were coming up.
Yeah. And we picked a couple different careers that are very well known. I often advise people to, if they have a thought that they might want to make a change, that they line up informational interviews, at least as an early
Absolutely.
start, to have a
Yeah.
conversation to check their assumptions on what things are like and establish relationships as well and a network. But gets back to that agency and back to that
Yeah.
taking things really seriously and intentionally and really working at getting that clarity. That's a key piece. Well, so um, I think we've talked about a number of different things, but if you were to kind of summarize, and I know this can be difficult because there's so many different factors of some key lessons learned, some key concepts that you would want to sort of highlight, what would those items be?
Well, just to recognize that this is a skill, learning the habits of mind that you need to have to be able to navigate a turbulent job market, regardless of your chosen profession or industry. That is a skill in of itself.
Hmm.
So, in other words, just choosing something and trying to follow it along as a career path isn't enough anymore. Like, it's really important to learn how to be thinking about what is my exit strategy? What is my plan B? What might be the next thing I'm going to want to do? Am I taking my temperature on how this is working for me? Am I also taking the temperature on my industry so I can think about, am I likely to get laid off in the next 6 months? Like, these are all habits of mind, both intrinsic and extrinsic, that I think are really important to navigate and manage one's career, regardless of what that profession or industry is. So that is what I hope would be a big takeaway from this, is that this is something else that's important for not only it's for students, yes, but for everybody to learn, and that can be learned.
And where do people go to folks like you? I mean, you're not available to the entire country or world, but
No. But, people have found the talk helpful, and part of the reason that I do teach a class on Coursera called Career Decisions: From Insight to Impact. It is often offered by Coursera for free. I don't
oh,
make money off of it. We put it out there under the Wesleyan name. It's a massive open online course, so anybody can take it all over the world, and it's really designed not as a writing a resume or going on a job interview. It's not practical in that sense, but it's a deeper dive into helping people figure out, who am I? What do I want out of life? What is working for me? What is not? How can I unpack all of those influences that are affecting my decision making? I think of it as kind of a flipped classroom on an advising process. So if you go through all of the exercises in the course, you may find that, you know what, I think I got this. I don't necessarily need to sit down with a professional
mhm.
counselor to work these things out. If you happen to, be in the States and have attended college here, though, and you're looking for the one-on-one, I do encourage people to go back to their alma maters, because you might be pleasantly surprised that a lot of universities do offer either discounted or free sessions through their career centers or through outside providers that they've contracted with to provide lower cost career advising for alumni.
Oh, that's great. Well, I have to say, this has been a real pleasure, and I wanted to thank you for coming on my podcast, YouTube
Yeah.
channel. For those listening or watching, I will put information in the show notes that Sharon referred to for this online course. And I will encourage you to go to her talks on TEDx, and check them out. It was really, really good material, and I think very inspiring in many ways. So thanks again, Sharon, for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay. Hey, thanks for joining me today on Titans of Transition. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please check the show notes for additional information.